All right, folks, get started in 1 minute. Just pouring my tea, so I've got something to drink while I'm talking with you folks. I should probably get my microphone out for this, but I don't think you folks are going to be that worried about the audio quality. I'm sure it could be better if I get my microphone out, but I think you can probably hear me well enough. This isn't exactly going out for broadcast, so I think we're probably fine. All right, and with that, it is 3:30. So let me go through. I'm going to start with the questions I received via email. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 12. Looks like I have 15 of those. It's a lot, but we can get through those. So let's start off. Number 8, explain the argument that segregation shielded Michelle Obama from discrimination. So number 8, this is from the Ta-Nehisi Coates book, particularly the chapter called American Girl. And Michelle Obama grew up on the south side of Chicago, and that is a predominantly African-American community. White flight in the 1960s meant there weren't really any white people living there. And that meant that she didn't perceive discrimination because she wasn't dealing with white people all the time. She didn't know what it was to be discriminated against until she got to college. Because there was no one there discriminating. Everyone in her immediate group was African American. Now, what's weird about this is that it does seem like an argument for segregation, right? That Michelle Obama avoided the worst effects of segregation simply because she wasn't experiencing it directly because she wasn't dealing with any white people. I don't think Coates means it that way. But I think Coates' larger point is that African Americans learn to internalize the way they need to act around white people. He talks about this concept of code switching, the idea that if you're an African American person, you need to have a different way of dealing with white people than you do with people of your own race. And something we're all, even those who are white, can understand. I mean, the idea is that you might act differently around your parents than you do around your friends. And that's a form of code switching. It's just more prevalent in the African American community. Because they do have to put on a show, basically, for white people so as not to scare them. And I think this is also something that Coates is arguing about Michelle Obama, is that she's not necessarily that good at this code switching. Because she didn't grow up among white people, she didn't learn early on how to adjust her behavior to do what white people kind of wanted her to do. And is that a bad thing or a good thing? Well, I mean, it depends on your perspective there. But for Michelle Obama, it means that people didn't necessarily know how to deal with her. And that she did upset, of course, a lot of white commentators who didn't see her acting the way they thought an African-American woman should act. So the argument is the segregation, the fact that there weren't any white people left in the south side of Chicago, tended to shield Michelle Obama from discrimination, simply because she didn't have to deal with white people and she didn't learn how to do it. And so therefore she didn't know that was different. You hear a lot of people talking this in terms of being poor, right? They didn't know they were poor until someone told them. And so it's almost like Michelle Obama didn't know she was black or didn't know she was supposed to be acting a certain way until someone told her. All right, let's go on to number 15. Number 15 is explain the lost cause narrative. So far, I'm picking up a trend here that you guys want to go back to the Coates book. So lost cause narrative is the argument that the Civil War was not about slavery, but rather the Civil War was about these noble Southerners fighting for states' rights, and centered oftentimes on Robert E. Lee, the general of the Southern forces in the Civil War. So the lost cause narrative is going to hold that, the South, they weren't fighting for slavery, they were fighting for states' rights, and they were doomed. But it was a noble cause. And that's important to say it was a noble cause, because the argument of the lost cause narrative is that the South wasn't wrong in what they were fighting for. They didn't have a chance of winning, but it wasn't wrong. And that's why it's so important for them to say that the Civil War was not about slavery, that it was really about states' rights. It was about these Federalist principles rather than being about slavery, because hopefully no one today is going to argue, slavery was actually a good cause to fight for. So the lost cause narrative requires that you say, first off, that the Civil War is about states' rights. It wasn't about slavery. And that the people fighting the South were actually very noble. They were good people who just happened to be fighting for a doomed cause. Now, of course, this is complete bullshit. the Civil War was about states' rights to the extent that the states wanted the right to have slavery. It was about slavery, and if you look at the discussions in even the legislation passed by Southern states in order to secede from the Union, they make it very clear that it was in fact all about slavery, that they were seceding in order to protect the right to have slaves. So it was states' rights to have slaves. So it wasn't noble. It was about slavery, and unless you think slavery is a good thing, there's no way you can argue that the Southern side of the Civil War was a good thing. But why do we accept this then? I mean, even in textbooks from the North, we still oftentimes will talk about this as being about states' rights and talk about Robert E. Lee. Well, this was a way, coming out of the 1920s, really 1900, 1920, 1930, it was a way for Northerners and Southerners to talk about the Civil War in a way that we could all agree on. And from the end of the Civil War in 1865 up through about the 1880s, the Republicans in the presidency was almost entirely dominated by Republicans during that period, always talked about how terrible the Civil War was. And the Civil War was this awful thing. Southerners are fighting for slavery. We beat them. Now the Southerners should shut up and go away. And they should reform. And the Southerners didn't want to. And this basically meant you could never totally reconcile the North and South, because your reconciliation would require that the Southerners admit they had done something wrong. And they didn't think they'd done something wrong. They genuinely believed that they were correct, and they were almost like occupied. This is when you get this idea of the South will rise again, like we'll rise up against our Yankee oppressors. So the North and people like Woodrow Wilson, who was a Southerner who had lived in New Jersey, so he was originally from Georgia, put forward this idea of the lost cause narrative, that it was really about states' rights. And even if the Northerners don't like what the South is doing, they can still say, well, we disagree with you, but we get what you were going for. You're going for states' rights, and we agree that's a good thing, even if we don't agree in the way you chose to go about it. So it's a way to create reconciliation between the North and the South. The problem with that sort of reconciliation is that the reconciliation between the North and the South brought on by the lost cause narrative, it is entirely dependent on getting rid of all the black people, right? Assuming that African Americans don't matter. Because then you can't just say, well, the Southerners were really, it was fine. They weren't fighting for anything bad. It was all good. But if you're African American, the argument that the Civil War was fought about something else, and they were actually all good people, don't worry about it, that's got to be deeply offensive. And it also erases the experience of African Americans to say that the Civil War wasn't really about you. But of course, by any conventional definition, Civil War is very much about them. All right, question number 19. In Applebaum's view, what is the purpose of the president in the original conception of the Constitution? So this comes up from the discussion that we had in class about the Electoral College and what the goal of Electoral College is and why we have it. So even if we don't agree the Electoral College is a good idea anymore, we still can argue about why and understand why the Electoral College is there in the first place. So Applebaum is arguing that the Electoral College is there in order to ensure that the president is not actually subject to the whims of the people or to the whims of the Congress. Now, today, of course, we want the president to be subject to the whims of the people. We want the president to stand up and basically be a counterbalancing force with Congress. But that's not the way the founders envisioned it. As far as the founders were concerned, the job of the president was to protect the Constitution from the people and from the House of Representatives. Where the founders didn't believe in democracy at all. They thought democracy was a terrible idea. It was going to be what they called mobocracy. It was just going to be people rising up, everyone demanding things, and government wasn't going to work because they weren't going to respect the rule of law. They weren't going to respect the rights of minorities. So you had to insulate the government from the public, and that was the job of the president. So the president is there not as a democratic figure, someone who represents the public, but rather as an anti-democratic player, much the way we see the Supreme Court now, to stop any excesses from the government. And of course, the founders saw the government as predominantly being the House of Representatives and the Senate. So the job of the president was to protect the Constitution from the House of Representatives and the Senate, and from indirectly the people. So why we want an electoral college? Well, because the job of the electoral college is there to insulate the president from the people. And so if the people are directing the president, then we can't expect the president to ignore what the people want. In the original conception of the presidency, his whole job is to ignore what the people want and do what's right by the Constitution, even if it's unpopular, even if nobody actually likes it. Right, number 22, is socialism popular in the United States? Socialist programs, why might they be different? So when we poll the term socialism, we ask Americans, hey, do you like socialism? Most Americans don't. The only group that has anything close to a favorable view of socialism is, in fact, your age group. People in the age of 35 say they kind of like it. They're not too against it. People over 35 generally don't like socialism at all. That said, socialist programs, such as they exist in the United States, are actually very popular. So when we say socialist programs, we talk about this a lot in class. The idea of socialist programs as being programs that are there that take taxpayer money to provide services, goods and services to people that they in theory could provide to themselves, but for whatever reason we've chosen to have the government provide them. So example socialist programs in the United States are things like Social Security, right? You could save up for your own retirement, or you could have the government. The government will take your tax dollars and give you retirement funds. Probably not enough to retire comfortably, but give you something. Medicare. So if you are elderly, you're going to get heavily subsidized healthcare from the government. This is what we call single-payer healthcare. The government just pays for everything and negotiates fees. And so this is the sort of thing that Republicans are currently, up in arms that the Democrats are proposing for everyone. It's we got Medicare right now. So that these are socialist programs. And there's plenty of other ones. Unemployment insurance is a socialist program. Workman's comp. These are all socialist programs. But the individual programs are relatively popular. Even we explain government programs and propose government programs to people. So if you explain Medicare for all, so anyone who wants to buy into Medicare could do so. Or if you explain, like Elizabeth Warren's child care plans, when we talk about in class, people like these programs. So there's this weird disconnect that they like the programs, but they don't like it when you say the word socialism. So why is that? It's because socialism has a bad rap, at least for older Americans. Older Americans were taught that socialism is just step one of the route to communism, and the communists are enemies. So we have to be against socialism, the same reason we're against communism, because it's antithetical to our way of life. But the individual programs, we have them. Well, people like those programs because they generally are run pretty well, pretty efficiently. So people like the programs, they like socialist programs, and they like even proposal socialist programs. They just don't like the word socialism. All right, number 35. What is civil forfeiture and how has it been limited in recent weeks? All right, so civil forfeiture is when the government seizes assets from someone, not because, there's two ways you can seize assets from someone. Easy way is if someone's arrested and they're charged with a crime, you can seize assets that are reasonably related to the crime. So if you are dealing drugs out of your SUV, I can seize your SUV when I arrest you for drugs. Fine. Civil forfeiture is a different process because the idea of civil forfeiture means I'm not actually charging you with a crime. That's why it's got the word civil in there. It's not criminal. And the idea is that the government seizes your assets because they have a reasonable belief that these assets were gained through some illegal means. Now, the problem with that is that you wind up in this weird situation when your assets have been seized. You have to prove those assets were not the result of some sort of illegal activity. And if you can prove that in court, then in theory, you can get your assets back. In practice, it's very hard to prove. If you have a bag of cash, it's hard to prove where you got that bag of cash. The government could seize that simply saying, oh, we think this is drug money. And you would have to somehow prove that it's not drug money in order to get back. And you'd have to go to hearings in order to prove it. And there's no normal legal process that you would follow. The reason for that is that a normal legal process would require the government to charge you and bring you in. But in civil forfeiture, the action is not against you as a citizen, but rather against your property. So you get these weird case names like the United States of America versus one bag of cash with $20,000 in it. So they're charging the bag of cash with being the result of illegal activity. And you have to somehow prove that it's not. So the civil forfeiture is especially problematic because in many jurisdictions, police are allowed to keep the results of the civil forfeiture, or at least a large percentage of them. So the police have an incentive to seize more because they want new police cars. And if they want new police cars, they got to seize $50,000 worth of stuff to buy a new police car. So there's an incentive for them to seize lots of stuff and kind of ask questions later. Because even if you do arrest, carry a civil forfeiture wrongly, well, they haven't violated anyone's rights because while you have rights, a bag of cash or your car doesn't have any rights. All right. So how has this been limited in recent weeks? We talked a little bit in class about this idea of the incorporation doctrine. The incorporation doctrine is the idea that parts of the Bill of Rights will apply to the states, but not all the Bill of Rights. If you read the Bill of Rights, it'll say things like Congress shall pass no, okay, actually it's Congress, because it's just the way they wrote things back in the day. Don't worry about it. It says Congress shall pass no law restricting freedom of speech or of the press. It doesn't say anything about the states. So if we stick to that interpretation of the Bill of Rights that only applies to Congress, then the state of New Jersey can pass a law restricting freedom of religion or freedom of press, or decide that no one's allowed to have guns. But the interpretation we've got of the Bill of Rights since the passage of the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment is one of those 3 Civil War amendments passed after the Civil War. The Southern states were required to ratify to get back in. And the Civil War amendments were designed to eliminate slavery. That's the 13th. But the 14th is there to try and make sure the Southern states treated all their citizens equally. And in the 20th century, the Supreme Court decided that meant that they had to apply parts of the Bill of Rights to the states. So this might come under the due process clause of the 14th Amendment that says you can't take away someone's property or put them in jail without due process of law. And if you can't do that, and say, well, what is due process of law? Well, that means you have to have something approaching a fair trial system. You have to have a fair government in order to have due process, in order to get the 14th Amendment. So in order to show you have a fair process, you would have to meet all these standards. So for instance, if someone doesn't have the right to a judge, or sorry, doesn't have the right to a jury of their peers, or doesn't have the right to a lawyer, you can't say that they're getting a fair trial. So therefore, there's no due process. Therefore, you violate the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment is going to incorporate some of the restrictions that are found in the Bill of Rights to apply to the states as well as to the federal government. So the incorporation doctrine holds that parts of the Bill of Rights, the important parts, as called the preferred freedoms doctrine, are going to apply to the states as well as to the federal government. Now, what does that have to do with civil forfeiture? Well, recently, Supreme Court held in I believe it was a unanimous 9-0 decision, which are pretty rare. Recently, the Supreme Court held that the part of the Bill of Rights, the 8th Amendment, that talks about excessive penalties applies to the states as well as the federal government. So the idea of excessive penalties always applied to the federal government, but the Supreme Court held that applied to the states as well. So the federal government, under the 8th Amendment, can't levy excessive fines. Normally, we only talk about the 8th Amendment, which is cruel and unusual punishment and the death penalty. In this case, we're talking about large fines. So the government can't put too big a fine on a minor crime. So if you're caught dealing marijuana, they can't fine you $100,000. Like it's not reasonable given the how bad the crime is. So the Supreme Court held 2 parts. Number 1, that civil forfeiture is in essence a fine, and number 2, that the excess fines clause of the 8th Amendment also applies to the states. So therefore, states can't have really big civil forfeiture if the civil forfeiture is only tied to minor crimes, that would be a violation of the 8th Amendment. All right, number 36. Number 36 asks, what is reification? So reification, this goes back to actually the very first lecture. So if you weren't in the first lecture, you joined the class late, understandably you wouldn't remember this. In the first lecture, we talked about this idea of the intersubjective. So we have the things that are objective, facts, right? The earth goes around the sun. It's a fact. I don't care if you're a flat earther, well, then you're just wrong. But fact, the earth goes around the sun. That's objective. Then we've got subjective. That sunset is beautiful. All right, so I've got objective and subjective. But there's some things that don't fall neatly into either category. We call these the intersubjective. So they define the intersubjective as there's some things that are subjective and that they're make-believe. We just made it up. But they're agreed upon by a large number of people in our society. But because of that, they have more power than something that's simply subjective. So I say that sunset's beautiful. You have no reason to believe that. You might disagree with me, and that's fine. And I can't do anything about it because it's a subjective opinion. However, if all of us as a society agree on some made-up bullshit, that becomes part of the intersubjective. So what would that be like? So the intersubjective might be something like, we live in the United States of America. All right, the United States of America is made up. A bunch of people made up this concept of the United States of America, or they made up this concept of race, or they made up any other major concept you can think of. And those things belong to the intersubjective. So the example I use in class for this is unicorns. So unicorns are made up bullshit. They don't exist. There's no such thing. But you can answer questions about unicorns. If I say, how many horns does a unicorn have? You know unicorns have 1 horn. And we all agree on this. And if someone says unicorns have 2 horns, that person is wrong. But that's stupid, because unicorns don't have any horns because unicorns don't exist. So this is the intersubjective, that we as a society agree that certain things are true, even though they're just made up bullshit. And we act as though those things are true. And by acting as though they're true, we actually summon them into being. And that's the process of reification. So we talk about this in this class largely in terms of racial differences. So the idea here is that we, as part of the intersubjective, have this idea that African Americans, so this is societally believed, African Americans might be not as hardworking as white Americans, or they might be worse in some other way. And this has been a stereotype that's been attached to all sorts of racial groups over American history. So we say this racial group is worse. They don't have jobs, or they don't smell good, or they're poor, or they've got all these bad habits. So we believe these bad things about this racial group. And because we believe these bad things, we then treat them differently. We don't let them go to good schools. We don't give them good jobs. And as a result, we have these beliefs. These beliefs get reinforced by the way we treat this group. And as a result, they wind up fulfilling those stereotypes. So yeah, African Americans wind up with less money, and they wind up having crappy jobs. Why? Because we treat them differently. Another example of this, up until the 20th century, it was believed that women were dumb. Basically there was no point in sending women to school because their brains, they couldn't learn things. Even if they did learn things, it would cause their uterus to just travel throughout their body. They wouldn't be able to have children, and they'd get depressed, and they'd get hysterical. The word hysterical actually just refers to a woman's uterus. So no point in educating women because they're just too dumb to learn. And then we had people, so then we believe, the societal belief, part of the intersubjective, that women are too dumb to learn. And then as a result, you don't bother sending them to school. Because why? Because they're too dumb to learn. And so then you observe, wow, it turns out women are dumb. Why are they dumb? Because you didn't send them to school. And if you didn't go to school, you'd be pretty dumb too. So we have reified this belief. So it starts off as this made-up belief, women aren't intellectually equal to men, winds up being something that is reinforced in society and therefore becomes to an extent true because you don't send women to school. So that's the process of reification. We have a belief in the intersubjective. We as a society act as though that belief is true. And then because we act, the results of us acting about that belief lead that belief to become true. So that's reification. All right, number 38. What is the mudslide? Mud spelled with two Ds. What does it have to do with Howard Schultz? So the mudslide is a famous interview given by CBS newsman Roger Mudd, I think it's CBS newsman Roger Mudd, to Ted Kennedy, when Ted Kennedy was going to challenge Jimmy Carter for the Democratic presidential nomination in the 1980 presidential election. And what happened during this famous interview is that Mudd asked Ted Kennedy, why do you want to be president? And Kennedy didn't have a good answer. He eventually did get to some sort of stumbling answer. For those of you who've never seen a Ted Kennedy interview, he sounds like Mayor Quimby from The Simpsons. And so he eventually did get to an answer, but it's thought that this interview kind of sealed his fate. Largely because you can't be president if you don't know why you want to be president. You can't even tell us what you want to do or what you stand for. And why do you want to be president? And the hit on Ted Kennedy was he wanted to be president because his brother had been president, and his other brother had run for president. And his dad had always wanted him to be president. So he didn't have a really good reason to be president. He just kind of wanted it. So as to Howard Schultz, well, Howard Schultz is asked a number of times in interviews. So Howard Schultz, remember, is the CEO of Starbucks who has talked about running for president. He hasn't actually officially announced yet if he's going to run or if he's going to run or not. But so Howard Schultz has been asked, what are you going to do? And the answer is he doesn't know. He's not willing to talk. He says, well, I don't want to talk about what issues I would actually do. And look, if you're running for president, it's actually a good idea not to talk about issues because they divide people. If you want to be popular, once you say what you're going to do, some people go, that's bullshit. I don't want that. And then you're going to get less popular. So Howard Schultz's strategy has been to not say anything about what he wants to do as president. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, politicians might want to say that they don't know what they're going to do or they don't want to talk about it. That's kind of the whole thing you do when you're running for president. You say what you want to do. And so if you're not willing to do that, then what are we even doing, right? And that's kind of Howard Schultz. In the last week, we've actually seen the same thing going on with a Democratic candidate for president, a guy named Beto O'Rourke. So Beto O'Rourke, previously a member of Congress from Texas, has also announced he's running for president, and he can't explain why in the world he wants to run for president. I mean, he doesn't seem to have big issues, but people like him. He's a reasonably interesting guy, and so people are talking about him and they like him, but he doesn't really seem to have a very good reason. Devin Williams has said in the chat, George Bush hates black people, so he's paraphrasing Kanye West. Kanye West, of course, during Hurricane Katrina fundraiser, said George Bush doesn't care about black people. And that certainly hit a lot of people to put on him. I think Kanye's quotes later on in the book's going to talk about this a bit. Okay, number 40. What lessons could we take away from Ralph Northam's handling of the blackface photos? Oh, okay. Well, before I get to that, Martha's asking, number 50, why is the Brexit process complicated the long-standing peace in Northern Ireland? All right, that's a good one. So make a mark of where we left off here. All right. So yeah, we are 24 minutes into this. Cool. All right, so why is the Brexit process complicated the long-standing peace in Northern Ireland? All right, so this was from the political Gabfest question, political Gabfest about 3 weeks ago now. They talked about the issue in Northern Ireland, what they refer to Northern Ireland as the Troubles. And essentially what happened in Ireland is all the terrible shit that that England did to the rest of the world through colonialism, they practiced in Ireland first. So they came to Ireland and they basically took over, the Protestants of England took over large portions of Ireland, just took the land outright. And they treated the Catholics who dominate Ireland very, very poorly. So we get like the potato famine. It wasn't because there were no potatoes, it's because they took all the potatoes and sold them to somebody else and didn't leave any for the Irish people to eat. So the Troubles are from basically the 1960s up through the 1980s. And this is when you had basically revolts in Ireland and very close to open warfare between Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom and is dominated by Protestants, and the rest of Ireland, which is dominated by Catholics. And so Catholics in Northern Ireland were trying to kick the UK out. And in order to do this, you had a lot of bombings. You had a group called the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, that was committing what we call terrorist attacks. Of course, they're white people. We don't really call what white people do terrorist attacks, but these are terrorist attacks. They're bombing people. So you have all this going on. And this eventually leads to a peace treaty. It's called the Good Friday Accords under President Clinton, largely negotiated by an Irish-American senator named George Mitchell. And the key issue that resolved the key part of the peace deal, the IRA had to disband, disarm, and the leaders of the IRA pretended they'd never done anything terroristic. But the part of the deal was you can't have a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So Ireland is the part, most of the island of Ireland is dominated by Catholics and is the country Republic of Ireland. The northern bit, there's a little bit in the north, I think about 15% of the land area of Ireland is what's called Northern Ireland. It's part of the United Kingdom, same country that has England and Scotland and Wales and all that. So the problem is, if Brexit goes through, Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, most of the island of Ireland, is still going to be part of the EU because Ireland's part of the European Union. Whereas Northern Ireland would be part of the UK, and if the UK leaves the EU, then congratulations, it's no longer part of the EU. So how do you have a border between so they don't have a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But if one's part of the EU and one's not, you have to have a border there because there's going to be tariffs, there's going to be tolls, there's going to be visa requirements. You're going to need, get your passport stamped across the border. So that's a real problem. And the fear is if you wind up going back to a hard border, like you build a big ass wall and tell people to stay on one side or the other and you put visa requirements in place. If that happens, boy, I don't know. People are worried this could lead to the trouble starting up again. This could lead to people, open warfare in Northern Ireland again. So this is why we're seeing this Brexit complicating the long-standing peace in Northern Ireland. And Theresa May's government, the current government, has not figured out how to do this, where they basically said, okay, we'll still not have a hard border there, but we'll basically, so there's no good answer. We'll have kind of a border in the ocean in the middle and not let things, so we'll have basically a border between Northern Ireland and the UK, even though they're part of the same country. There's no good solution to this. Something that the people arguing for Brexit didn't really think about at all when they were opposing Brexit, but it's wound up being one of the major sticking points in Brexit negotiations. Okay, thank you for that, Marta. Let's move on. Let's go back to, unless again, the one over in the chat. Again, if you just joined us over here on the chat window, you can come in and ask any questions and you will get precedence. Number 40, what lessons can we take away from Ralph Northam's handling of the blackface photos? So for those of you who don't remember, Ralph Northam is the governor of Virginia. And it turned out not too long ago that one of his political opponents basically as a result of Northam's stance on abortion that came out during a legislative hearing. One of Northam's medical school classmates leaked to the press photos of Northam from, well, we think it's Northam, photos from Northam's yearbook page in his medical school yearbook. So this would have been when Northam was in his 20s. He was in medical school, and there's a photo of him on his yearbook page. And we don't know if it's him. He says it's not. But if it's not him, why in the world is on his yearbook page? The photo of two people, one of whom is dressed in a Ku Klux Klan uniform, and one of whom is in blackface, and the person in blackface has a noose around their neck, being held by the person in the Ku Klux Klan uniform. So this is obviously not great for Virginia, a state that has a long history of problems with slavery and problems with race relations. And so Northam initially apologized, said, boy, I'm really sorry. This is unacceptable. I know. I'm really sorry. And he kind of hoped that that would get him through it. The people say, okay, well, it's fine. Then don't worry about it. But some people said, this is bullshit. You have to resign. But he didn't. And in fact, the next day, after he had apologized for the photos, he held a press conference where he claimed it wasn't, in fact, him. He was not in blackface, and he was not doing the KKK in the KKK uniform. And he would submit to forensic analysis the photos to prove that wasn't him. And I don't know how that would work because the guy in the KKK mask is wearing a mask and a hood. I don't know how you're going to prove it's not Northam in that. And then Northam claimed, oh, but even though that's not him in the photos, he never wore blackface then. He actually had worn blackface at another event where he had dressed up like Michael Jackson in the mid-'80s, which is weird for a lot of reasons. First off, blackface was not cool in the 80s. Not that it was ever cool, but definitely not cool in the 80s. And second off, like Michael Jackson's like the one African-American guy that you probably don't have to wear blackface to impersonate. Anyway, so, and then he offered to do the moonwalk on stage until his wife said, no, not appropriate. Let's not do that. Anyway, so Northam said, it's not me. I didn't do anything wrong, except for that one time I dressed up like Michael Jackson blackface. And that's, he said, why I would remember if I was in blackface, because it was a real pain in the ass to get the shoe polish off my face. Anyway, so did Northam resign? Nope. He was probably helped quite a bit by the fact that at almost the same time, and this is not a coincidence, his lieutenant governor, an African-American man, who presumably has never worn blackface, was incredibly accused of sexual assault, from decades earlier. But so if you get rid of the guy in blackface, you get the sexual assaulter. And the third in line was the Attorney General of Virginia, who also had been in blackface. Didn't have any good answers. So Northam just stuck around. He just didn't resign, even though this is all the calls for him to resign. It's been more than a month, and he hasn't resigned, and he's going to stick around because there's no appetite. They say, well, we can't impeach you for something you did a long time ago. So I guess you're still governor. Everyone hates you now, but you're still governor. So what lessons can we take away from that? If there's a political scandal, you can just kind of wait this shit out. You can wait it out. And eventually people move on to something else, especially during the Trump administration. There's always some other scandal, and people are eventually going to forget about it. And if you can just wait it out, you can probably survive politically. Things that a long time ago would definitely have taken you out. Number 41, what negative consequences might arise from a presidential popular vote system? This is back to our discussion of the Electoral College. So suppose tomorrow we moved over into a presidential popular vote system. What would go wrong if we got rid of the Electoral College? Well, there's a couple arguments about what could happen. So one argument is that if we had a presidential popular vote system rather than an Electoral College system, people would, presidential candidates rather, would just ignore a lot of states. So right now, there's small states where they go because those are swing states. Presidential candidates go to all the swing states. But if there's no such thing as swing states, I'm trying to get the most votes overall. The argument is that presidential candidates would bother only going to the most populous, most densely populated areas where they could turn out the most votes. So candidates spend a lot of time in New York City because there's a lot of voters there, or they spend a lot of time in Los Angeles or California, and they would just fly the hell over Oklahoma and Iowa and Kansas because there's not enough people that make it worth their while. So they cater to urban voters and basically ignore rural voters. Kiki, I see your question, and we'll get there in a minute. So also, in 2000, we had this long national crisis about Florida and the recount in Florida. We had to recount all these millions of ballots. But that was only one state, and it paralyzed the country for about 6 weeks trying to figure out who actually won Florida. Sorry, more than that, probably closer, a little more than 2 months. So if you had a national popular vote system, then you could, in theory, have recounts everywhere. as what the losing candidate tries to look for more votes. So that's a real problem. That's potentially a real problem. You could have a lot more recounts and be a lot less certainty about the election. Some of the authors in the book bring up some other things that might happen that I think are mostly bullshit. They say, well, the Electoral College makes sure that a candidate gets a clear majority of the Electoral College, even if they don't get a majority of the popular vote, which is true, but no one ever says, oh, well, they won the Electoral College, but even though they didn't win the popular votes, they're totally legitimate. Okay, Donald Trump says that. But no one else really thinks that, so that's not really a reasonable argument to be making. There's also arguing in the book that it will lead to the end of federalism, and I don't even understand where the hell they're getting that. It doesn't seem to make any sense at all. All right, Kiki's question, number 55. Why might a jurisdiction choose to be a sanctuary city or state? The Kiana, just a key there. So the argument here, a sanctuary city or sanctuary state is one that does not cooperate with federal immigration law. So the idea is that right now, if you are not in a sanctuary city or sanctuary state, and the police arrest you, they'll run your name through a database. And if it turns out that you are in the country illegally, you are an undocumented immigrant, that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, will ask the local jurisdiction to hold on to you in their prison until they can come pick you up. And this is legally questionable to a lot of law enforcement officers because they say, okay, look, this person's in jail. I have to release them. But the federal government's saying they want me to hold on to them. So I'm going to keep them in jail for an extra 48 hours or 72 hours or an extra week because someone asked me to, even though I don't personally have knowledge of any crime they committed. So that's, legally a little tricky. Can the police hold you even though you didn't commit any crime in their jurisdiction? So a sanctuary city or sanctuary state is one in which basically the police just don't cooperate. If ICE says, hey, could you hold on this guy for 40 hours? They go, nope, sorry, not going to do it. And if you act that way, you are a sanctuary city or a sanctuary state. So why would cities or states do that? Well, as I said, there are some legal issues here. But it's mostly because local police actually are generally not interested in enforcing immigration law. So the federal government is interested in enforcing immigration law. Of course they are. But local governments, if I'm the local police, I'm much more concerned with trying to make sure that local people who are undocumented immigrants report crimes. If they get attacked, they report it. If they feel comfortable talking with the police. And if I'm not a sanctuary city, if I'm going to turn people over to the feds, then they're not going to come forward. They're not going to be witnesses. They're not going to be complainants. And there's going to be parts of my jurisdiction that are going to be basically lawless because people are going to be unwilling to report crimes. And so they've got people who politically disagree with especially President Trump's view on immigration. So that's basically what happened in New Jersey. We're now a sanctuary state. Where cities don't, in the state of New Jersey, no one's allowed to call. The cities aren't allowed to call the feds or hold people extra time for the feds. And that's because our governor, Phil Murphy, disagrees, and most people in New Jersey, we should say, disagree with the president's stance on immigration. Number two, could be legal questions. Are we allowed to hold someone because the feds asked us to? And number three, it could be because they want to engender greater cooperation between undocumented immigrants and local law enforcement. So those are the reasons why they would choose to be a sanctuary city or sanctuary state. Marty's got another question, number 53. Why is it so hard to increase the number of deportations beyond what it is now? So when Barack Obama was president, he dramatically ramped up the number of deportations. This was largely an attempt to impress upon Republicans in Congress that he was serious about undocumented immigration. And he was going to be tough on immigrants. And because he was tough on immigrants, you could trust him to work on an immigration deal. It didn't work. Which is why we had the whole problem with DACA and all that. But let's suppose President Trump wanted to increase deportations. He talked about how he wants to increase the number of deportations. The big problem is that we have limitations on how many immigrants we can actually deport. Now, the immigrants that are easiest to deport are essentially people who come over the southern border from Mexico, and you catch them. And if you catch them within 100 miles of the border, and you caught them in the act of crossing over, you just send them right back. And you put them on a bus and you send them right back to Mexico. And that's the end of it. It's real easy to deport those people. They don't initially have a lot of due process rights. Now, the problem is that type of immigration is becoming relatively rare. There's not a lot of people who are immigrating in that way, just crossing over the border and running, trying to find jobs. So if you want to increase deportations, you actually have to go and find people who are living in the country, who are living far from the border, and deport them, which is where most immigrants are. Remember, most undocumented immigrants don't come over the border. They fly on an airplane. And so they're somewhere in the middle of the country. The problem is if they've been here for a while, in the middle of the country, they're not near a border, you can't just put them on a bus and send them back. They get a hearing. and they have due process rights. And that winds up being a real way to slow down the system, because you have to have juries and you have to have lawyers involved. And once you have lawyers and juries and judges and you have the whole legal system involved, everything gets slowed down. So if you want to increase the number of deportations you have per year, you'd have to hire a hell of a lot more lawyers, have to hire a hell of a lot more judges, open a lot more immigration courts. And that costs a lot of money. Even if you're willing to spend the money, judges don't just come out of nowhere. They have to be appointed. They have to be appointed and approved by the Senate. And there's all these other issues that come up. So the legal process slows down the number of immigrants you can actually deport. In addition to that, immigrants that are coming to the United States now are much more likely to claim asylum. They say we're not just coming for economic opportunity, which even may be why most of them are coming, but because we face a reasonable fear of persecution in our home country. Now, if an immigrant claims asylum, they have a legal right under international law to claim asylum here. And you can't just say, no, put them on a bus and send them home. At that point, again, they have to have hearings, and those hearings are going to slow the whole process down. If you wanted, and President Trump does, he said he does, wants to dramatically increase the number of deportations, it's not at all clear how you would do it without dramatically ramping up the number of judges, the number of lawyers that are involved in the whole process. And even then, if you go too much faster, how much are you really paying attention to actual legitimate claims of asylum? Which, of course, what we really want to do. If someone really is in fear for going back to life, they have a right to stay here until the political situation in their home country is taken care of. All right, number 44, what's the point of the pound cake speech? So the pound cake speech, the famous speech given by Bill Cosby, is covered in chapter 1 of the Ta-Nehisi Coates book we've been reading. And in the pound cake speech, Bill Cosby, I hope I didn't say Bill Clinton, it's Bill Cosby, talks about how, sometimes kids get shot for stealing stuff, and black kids get shot for stealing stuff, like stealing a piece of pound cake. But it's their own damn fault, because why were they doing with that piece of pound cake? Why did they steal it? If they hadn't stolen it, they wouldn't have gotten shot. And the point of this argument for what we call African-American conservatism. The idea that the problems in the African-American community aren't problems of law enforcement, aren't problems of systemic racism, but are rather problems brought upon by African-American people on themselves. Now, this is not the most popular view within the African-American community, but it's a place in which Bill Cosby has gotten very famous for arguing, and there are plenty of other African-American conservatives, that if African-Americans just act better than everyone else, they won't have these problems, that the problems of racism are largely problems of individual actions rather than being problems of people, rather than being societal problems or problems of systemic racism. Number 46, why are some worried about a runaway Article 5 convention? So Article 5 convention, so the Constitution allows 2/3 of the states to get together and declare a constitutional convention. And if they do that, the state representatives from all the states get together and they can revise the Constitution or write a whole new Constitution. Now, the reason we have this clause in the Constitution, Article 5, is because this is how the Constitution itself got written. A bunch of states decided the Articles of Confederation were working, and they put together a convention to fix the Articles of Confederation, and eventually decided to just throw the whole damn thing out and create a new convention, create a new government that is the Constitution. So, why are we worried about? So the fear is if you had an Article 5 convention just to fix some things, it would wind up being a runaway convention, and they would wind up doing all sorts of things that people didn't necessarily want them to do. So why would we worry about a runaway Article 5 convention? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, we might worry about a runaway Article 5 convention because there's nothing in the Constitution. Once you have an Article 5 convention, there's no way you can limit them to say, oh, well, you're only allowed to talk about these things. They can talk about whatever they want, just as the original writers of the framers of the Constitution were just supposed to be fixing the Articles of Confederation. They wound up writing a whole new damn thing. You can't limit them once you let them loose on it. There's no constitutional provision to stop them from doing it. Now, the head of the Constitution, you could, within the convention, they could try and limit it. But, George Washington, who was head of the Constitutional Convention, didn't do anything to limit that one. Why else would we worry about the Article 5 convention line being a runaway? Well, because exactly one time we've done this in American history was when when the Constitution was written. And that was a runaway convention. They weren't supposed to rewrite the whole Constitution. They weren't supposed to write a new Constitution. They were supposed to be fixing the Articles of Confederation. But what they do? They wrote a new Constitution. So in our historical experience, it seems like runaway convention is something that actually does happen. So why would we worry about this? I mean, we wouldn't want to even want to fix a few things. We don't want to fix everything because we don't feel as though we can probably get a deal where the whole country would support a new constitution if you change things that they liked, that they cared about. Number 60, would it be accurate to characterize Bill Cosby as an integrationist? Why or not? So an integrationist would be someone who believes that within African-American politics, would be someone who believes that African Americans should simply integrate and not try and maintain a distinctive culture. And I think that's very much what Bill Cosby argues for, is that he says, look, why do you have names that reflect African heritage? Why do you dress differently with saggy pants? He's very worried about saggy pants and the rap music. So what you should do, if you want to not face the results of systemic racism, if you want to be treated equally, is you should act better than white people have to. And then they'll treat you nicely. And that's essentially Cosby's base argument. So is this integrationist? Yeah. He's saying there's no reason to maintain a separate society for African Americans, or have your own culture, your own neighborhoods. That African Americans, if they want to be taken seriously, they want to be treated equally, should just integrate into white neighborhoods, should act like white people. And if you do that, then you won't have any problems. And look, if you're Bill Cosby, this makes sense. Because Bill Cosby has made his career going back to the 1960s. He was the first African-American man to be a lead in a network television show called I Spy with him and Robert Culp. It worked out well for him. Like he said, look, he never did racial humor. He never talked about being African-American. And he's fine. Everyone treated him nicely. And so he sees that as a universal experience, that if you just act right, you don't have to worry about it. So is Bill Cosby integrationist? Absolutely. And we'd put this up against people like Malcolm X, who are arguing that, no, you have to build your own communities up first and live in African American communities, shop at African American stores, socialize with other African Americans, build up the African American community, basically get rich first, build up your society to be so strong, and then try and integrate, and then try and move in with the white people. And if you do that, the white people will accept you, but you have to do it from a position of strength. You have to be strong first, and then you can be on equal terms with the whites. And I think Malcolm X and some of those followers would agree that's probably never going to happen. The whites are never going to be nice to you, no matter what you do. What you have to do instead is get to a position of strength, build up your own community, and then you can come back and try and get what you're due from the white people. Number 52, why in the world would Stony Rushing be trying to look like Boss Hogg? Again, I would encourage you to Google Stony Rushing, Google Boss Hogg. It is bizarre that he's trying to do it. But the argument here is essentially he is trying to show he is authentically Southern, right? So he's saying, look, I'm not worried about being politically incorrect. Yeah, Boss Hogg is a criminal and a segregationist and a racist, but he's a Southern. He's a real guy from, he's really, so he's saying I'm authentically Southern in the same way that Boss Hogg is authentically Southern. And that's why you can trust me as your member of Congress, despite the fact that I'm pretending to be a criminal grifter. Yeah, it's not great. Mystique asks, can you explain why the national emergency does, what the national emergency declaration does, and why a president would declare it? Sure. So President Trump's, under the National Emergency Act of 1976, the president is allowed to declare a national emergency under certain circumstances. And then once he's declared national emergency, he's allowed to move money that has already been appropriated by Congress. So the Constitution does say that any money cannot be spent by the federal government unless it has been duly appropriated by Congress. So Congress has to approve the money. What national emergency does is allow the president to reprogram some of that money, to move it to a use other than the use that Congress had originally intended for it. The National Emergency Act is actually pretty specific about where the money can come from and where the money can go to. So what does the Declaration of National Emergency President Trump recently signed allow him to do? Well, what essentially allows him to do is take money that's been allocated to the Department of Defense for one function, anti-drug functions, and for construction of military necessities, so military construction budget, and move it over into a different account, in this case, to build a wall on the southern border. So he's able to reprogram that money. So that's why he does it. Now, why would a president declare it? In this case, the president declares this national emergency. As written, the National Emergency Act is there for when the president needs money to do something really, really quickly and can't wait for Congress. So if we go to war tomorrow and they draft all y'all asses and you all get drafted, the government needs to build a lot more barracks, a lot more military bases. So the president's allowed to say, okay, we need to build a lot of barracks for all these new soldiers that we're taking from FDU and Drew. We're going to take all those soldiers. We have to build barracks for all of them. So we're going to take all this money we were supposed to be paying other things we're used to build barracks. And they can do that if it's an emergency. And in theory, the next year, the Congress will catch up and will allocate the money for that. In this case, the president's taking the money out of the Department of Defense and using it for something that's not quite related to defense. I mean, building a border wall. So he actually, one of the challenges to this is going to come from court, is the argument that this isn't actually for the troops, so you can't actually use the National Emergency Act for this. So why is this president declaring it? Well, rather than the normal emergency, we need money right away. In this case, the president's declared the national emergency because he wasn't able to get funding for his wall through Congress. And rather than just decide, oh, I lost, okay, we'll fight harder next time, presidents recognize that he will not get this funding from Democrats in the House of Representatives or from, honestly, the Senate, even though it's run by Republicans. They're not going to give him the money for it because it's unpopular. Members of Congress aren't stupid. And so this is a way for him to get an end run around it. I think the president also, one would hope, or at least his advisors know, that he's not actually going to get the wall this way. Right? This is going to be tied up in courts for several years until probably after the 2020 election. So nothing's going to happen. But it's a way for him to show his supporters, like, yeah, I'm doing everything I can to build this wall. It's so important to me. I promise you to build a wall. I promise you Mexico will pay for it. And we're going to keep, I guess, one of those promises. All right, number 56, 10 minutes left here. So you've got a question, you want to get it on the chat, this is the time to do it. Why may Kamala Harris's background as a prosecutor be a problem for her in the Democratic primary? So normally think of Kamala Harris's background as a prosecutor. She was the attorney general. She was a head prosecutor in San Francisco and attorney general of the state of California. We think that's good for Democrats because if you are a prosecutor, it means you can show you're tough on crime. The problem is for Kamala Harris is that being tough on crime is probably not a good thing right now in the Democratic primary. A lot of Democrats are very concerned about social justice and about the fact that the prosecution system is very much tilted against people of color. And so, Kamala Harris doesn't have a great record on that. In particular, people talk about one time when you had a police shooting in her jurisdiction, and she really didn't push as hard as people would have liked for her to push on that police shooting. So that's why it could be a problem that she might show, while it does show tough on crime isn't necessarily a good thing in the Democratic primary. Another question from Mystique, can you explain the difference between privatization and outsourcing? Sure. So we got government functions, and we want to introduce some element of competition or private companies being into it. So privatization is when the government basically sells off a function to another group. So it says, all right, look, that would be if the government decides, all right, we are not going to run. We talked about the example at FDU, right? So at FDU, we outsource the food service. So we still own the cafeteria, but we outsource it, meaning that we hire a company to come in and run the cafeteria for you guys. So that's outsourcing. FDU still kind of controls it, but we've hired someone to take care of the stuff that we're not necessarily good at. A lot of federal agencies are going to outsource janitorial services, right? There's no reason the workers who are cleaning up in the federal buildings have to be federal workers. They hire another company. That other company comes in and does the work. So that's outsourcing. The government retains control of the function, but is hiring a private company to carry out the function for it. Privatization means that the government has gotten rid of that function completely, is letting someone else do it. So there are some airports, San Francisco, for instance, in the United States, where the TSA doesn't actually do baggage checks. They have just hired another company to do it. They're not in charge of that anymore at all. It's somebody else's problem. We talked about this in the context of New Jersey, right? New Jersey, in theory, could sell the turnpike and the parkway to a private company and let that private company run it. So when you outsource, you still control, you're just hiring someone to do that function for you. When you privatize, you sell off that function. And now it's a private company that's completely responsible for it. So in theory, if FDU doesn't like the way that the people running the cafeteria, gourmet dining, are running it, well, then we can fire them eventually. We can get rid of them. But if it's privatized, we've sold it to them. It's not our business anymore. We can't do anything about it. If we don't like it, well, maybe there's another company that'll come up and do a better job and buy them out. So privatization, we sell off a whole government function. Government doesn't do it anymore. Outsourcing, we hire a company on a temporary basis to do that function for us. Hope that clears that up. If not, I got more questions you can put over in the chat box. We do have 7 more minutes in the live stream. All right, number 58. Why is Malcolm X careful never drink alcohol, never seen with a woman other his wife, always be impeccably dressed, and so forth? Let's go back to something we were talking about a little while ago about this idea of integrationism in Bill Cosby, right? So Bill Cosby, as the African-American conservatives argue, African-Americans just have to be twice as good as everyone else. And Malcolm X, I think, followed that dictum, even though I don't think anyone would describe him as an African-American conservative, where he did dress impeccably. He made sure that there was nothing personally about him to criticize because he believed, I think probably correctly, that if there were anything personal about him criticized, people would criticize that rather than criticize his actual policy ideas or his actual arguments. So you got to make sure to be completely above reproach in order that people wouldn't, because any weakness he has in that area would be seized upon by everyone, right? So Martin Luther King, for instance, was a philanderer. He cheated on his wife a lot. And so as a result, right, that became a way for the government to pressure him and people to blackmail him. And that really distracted from what he was trying to do. Now, that sort of philandering was going on with all sorts of political figures in the 1960s. I mean, at the same time, John F. Kennedy was sleeping with anything on two legs. But it didn't matter John F. Kennedy because he was white. It mattered Martin Luther King because he was black. And so Malcolm X looked at that and goes, okay, so the solution to this is if you're black, you have to be twice as good as everyone else. You have to make sure there's nothing anyone can say about you. And as long as you do that, then that's the only way you're going to be able to succeed as an African-American leader. Okay, and last one I had circled here was number 60 about Bill Cosby as an integrationist, and we have already covered that. So with that, it looks like I'm out of questions. I'll take about another 30 seconds. We've got 5.5 minutes left. Take another 30 seconds to wait for any more questions to come to the chat. If they don't, that's great. This feed will stay up at least for a couple months, so you can go back and get answers for anything on this that you need in the future. Thank you all for tuning in, and those of you who weren't tuning in yet, we're tuning in the future. Say hello to me from me. All right, thanks very much, and I will see you all for the test on the 19th.